You really think you can do this job? Jake Monroe muttered, watching Rachel Williams as she carefully wiped down the side of his car. He leaned against the hood, his arms crossed, a smirk plastered on his face. I mean, look at you. You should be doing something, well, less important. Rachel didn't flinch. She simply continued her task, her movements steady and controlled, her hands working with precision. Jake watched her for a moment longer, his smirk deepening. What are you the help? You don't belong here, he added, his voice dripping with disdain. The words hung in the air like a bad smell, but Rachel didn't react. She focused on the task at hand, cleaning every corner of the car as though she had done it 1,000 times before. Jake couldn't resist. Are you going to keep ignoring me, or are you finally going to admit it? You're out of your league, he sneered. He took a few steps closer to her, his tone growing more arrogant. Rachel didn't look up. She just wiped the window, her silence more powerful than any words could be. Her mind, however, wasn't on the task at hand. She thought back to why she was here, why she took this assignment. The quiet tension in the air was the backdrop to a far bigger mission, one that Jake had no idea she was involved in. Rachel wasn't just any woman cleaning cars. She was the FBI director, working undercover to expose corruption within the police force. Jake, a man full of his own sense of superiority, was one of the very officers under investigation. But none of that mattered to him. To him, Rachel was just a woman who didn't deserve to be there, someone to look down on. I bet you're not even good at this. Just a waste of time, he said, shaking his head in mock disbelief. If you weren't so pathetic, I'd ask you to hurry up. I've got places to be. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, clearly dismissing her. Rachel's face remained unreadable, her hand pausing mid-wipe. She could feel the weight of his words, the sting of his judgment. But she didn't let it show. This was just another part of her job. She was here for a reason. Her silence, though, had a purpose. It wasn't just to endure the insults. It was a strategy. Let him talk. Let him believe he was in control. Let him think that she was nothing but a lowly woman doing a menial job. The longer he spoke, the more the walls around him built higher. You know, I bet they hired you for this because you couldn't get a real job, Jake said with a laugh, not noticing Rachel's slow, controlled exhale. Look at you, just standing there, doing a menial job for pennies. Jake chuckled to himself as he stepped away, now convinced he had made his point. Rachel finished cleaning the last window, then slowly stood up. The moment she turned to face Jake, there was something different in her expression. No anger, no frustration, just an unshakable calm. She looked at him, her voice steady. You don't know who I am, do you? Jake froze, his confident posture suddenly faltering. She watched him for a beat, the weight of the moment sinking in. Then, Rachel spoke again, the words simple but carrying the weight of 1,000 truths. I'm your boss. Jake blinked, the color draining from his face as the realization hit him. Rachel wasn't just some woman cleaning his car. She was the FBI director, and she was here for a reason. The power dynamics had just shifted, and Jake had no idea what was coming next. Jake stood there, his mouth hanging open, the words from Rachel's lips still echoing in his mind. His confidence from just moments ago had completely vanished. He blinked several times, as though trying to process what he had just heard. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he held all the power. But now, everything felt wrong. He looked at Rachel as if she had just revealed some deep, hidden secret about herself, which, in a way, she had. You're what? He stammered, unable to form a coherent response. Rachel didn't flinch. She stood there, calm and composed, as if this moment was just another day at the office. She didn't need to explain herself further, and she didn't. The silence between them thickened. Jake's heart raced, and for the first time, he felt like he was the one under the microscope. Rachel didn't need to say another word. Her presence alone was enough to send waves of doubt crashing through Jake's mind. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but the cool, unwavering gaze from Rachel stopped him. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his mind racing as he tried to regain control of the situation, but he couldn't. The confidence he once held was slipping away with every passing second. I didn't know, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Rachel didn't respond. She simply gave him a look that said everything. The look that told him she was in charge now. He stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling both humiliated and uncertain. His usual bravado, the way he had treated others with condescension, had failed him here. He had misjudged her completely. In the back of his mind, Jake knew he had crossed a line. He had been rude, disrespectful, and blind to who Rachel truly was. But it wasn't too late. He could still apologize, could still try to salvage some of his dignity. "Look, I'm sorry," he said, his voice awkward and unsure. "I didn't mean to." Rachel held up a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. There was no need for apologies. She didn't want them. In fact, she didn't need them at all. She had already won. The power dynamic had shifted in the blink of an eye, and Jake knew he couldn't undo what had already happened. He could feel the weight of his own ignorance, and the regret began to settle in his chest. But Rachel wasn't interested in making him feel guilty. She was a professional, and she had a job to do. She glanced at her watch, then back at him, her expression still unreadable. "I'll be in touch, Officer Monroe," she said, her voice calm and firm. "This isn't over." Her words were like a quiet warning, a promise that he hadn't heard the last of her. Jake didn't know what to say. He stood there for a moment, watching Rachel turn and walk away, every step echoing in his mind. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he was untouchable. But now, standing there in the quiet aftermath, he realized just how wrong he had been. The realization stung, but it was too late for him to do anything about it. Rachel had already taken control of the situation, and he had no choice but to watch as it unfolded. He stood there, his mind reeling, as he watched Rachel disappear into the distance. He knew that whatever came next would be something he could never predict, and deep down, he felt a growing sense of dread about the consequences of his actions. Rachel walked away, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, each step echoing louder in Jake's mind. He stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and regret. He had assumed control. He had dismissed her, and now, she was walking away, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his own arrogance. Rachel had made her point, but Jake wasn't ready to accept it. He couldn't understand how he could have been so blind. A woman like her, cleaning his car, and she turned out to be more powerful than he could ever imagine. He had no idea how deep the investigation went or how much danger he was truly in. But he would soon find out. As the day went on, Jake's unease only grew. He kept replaying the conversation in his mind, her calm demeanor, her final words. "I'll be in touch, Officer Monroe. This isn't over." He had thought nothing of it at the time, brushing it off as just another threat. But now it haunted him. The weight of those words began to settle in his chest, a constant reminder of how out of control he was. Hours passed, and Jake's discomfort didn't fade. He tried to keep himself busy with his usual routine, but the thoughts kept creeping in. What if she wasn't just a random woman? What if Rachel really was his superior? What if everything he had done, his attitude, his actions, was being watched? His mind raced as he began to realize that the woman he had mocked was someone with the power to ruin his career, his life. But the worst part? He had no idea what her next move would be. That night, as Jake sat at home, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name. FBI Director Rachel Williams. The message was brief, only a few words. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. My office." Jake's stomach twisted. His first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't seen it. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He couldn't escape this. He had made a mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. The next morning, Jake arrived at the FBI office, his hands clammy and his thoughts scattered. He had no idea what to expect, but the unease in his chest had only grown stronger. The building loomed before him, cold and imposing, a stark contrast to his usual surroundings. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as he walked through the doors. Inside, everything felt different. The walls, the floors, even the air, it all felt like a reminder that he didn't belong here. He was out of his element. He was in her world now. Rachel was already waiting for him, sitting behind a large desk in a sleek, modern office. Her expression was calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that made Jake's heart race. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do. "Come in, Officer Monroe," she said, her voice smooth, commanding. Jake stepped inside, his legs feeling heavier with each step. He sat down across from her, the silence stretching between them. "You wanted to talk?" he asked, trying to sound confident, but the words felt hollow. Rachel didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her gaze unwavering. It was as if she was waiting for him to break, to acknowledge his mistake before she even said a word. Jake shifted in his seat, the tension building. Finally, Rachel spoke. "You've made some very poor choices, Officer Monroe," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And now, we're going to fix them. But not for you, for the people you've hurt." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. "This is your chance to make things right. But understand this, you're not in control anymore. I am." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as Rachel's words sank in. He had been so sure of himself, but now, in this moment, he felt like a child again, helpless and uncertain. The power had shifted completely, and he had no idea what the consequences would be. Rachel smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving his. "Now let's talk about what happens next." Rachel's gaze never wavered as Jake sat across from her, his hands clammy and his mind racing. He had expected confrontation, but nothing like this. He had always been the one in control, the one who could make decisions and twist situations to his advantage. But now, for the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. He swallowed, trying to push down the anxiety building in his chest. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice sounding shaky even to him. "What exactly do you want from me?" Rachel leaned back in her chair, her hands steepled in front of her. "It's not about what I want from you, Officer Monroe," she said slowly, her voice calm but firm. "It's about what's right." Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, something that had been happening behind the scenes that he hadn't even realized. "You've been part of a system that's broken," Rachel continued, her tone never changing. "A system that you've chosen to be a part of. And now, the time has come to make sure it's fixed." Jake wanted to argue, to deny everything she was saying, but the truth was, he knew deep down that she was right. He had seen the corruption, the abuse of power, the way things were swept under the rug. He had seen it, and he had turned a blind eye. He had been complicit. Rachel's eyes were steady on him, her gaze unwavering. "You have two choices, Officer Monroe," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You can help us bring this all down, or you can stand by and watch as everything unravels. And believe me, it will unravel. It's only a matter of time." Jake's mind raced as he weighed his options. He knew he was at a crossroads, a moment that could define the rest of his life. He could choose to stand with the people who had been abusing their power, or he could stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. But the fear gnawed at him. The fear of losing everything, his job, his reputation, everything he had worked for. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice softer but no less firm. "This isn't a choice between right and wrong," she said, her eyes locking with his. "This is a choice between survival and self-destruction." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of what she was saying. This wasn't just about doing the right thing, it was about protecting himself. But the price of that protection would be his integrity. Rachel stood up, walking around her desk to stand in front of him. She didn't say a word, but her presence filled the room, commanding it in a way that left Jake no room to argue. "Think carefully, Officer Monroe," she said quietly. "You may have once thought you were untouchable, but that's not the case anymore. The only question left is, which side are you on?" Jake looked up at her, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a simple decision. It was a moment that would change everything. He knew it. Rachel had given him the power to decide, but in doing so, she had stripped away any illusion of control he had left. His entire life had been built on a lie, and now, it was time to face the consequences. He didn't know what he would do yet, but he knew one thing. There was no going back. As he walked out of the office, the weight of Rachel's words stayed with him, pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been given a choice, but the real question was whether he had the strength to make the right one. Jake sat in his car, parked a few blocks away from the FBI office, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind a mess of thoughts and doubts. He had left Rachel's office in a daze, her words echoing in his ears. The choice she had given him seemed impossible. He had spent his whole life climbing the ranks, doing what was expected, maintaining a facade of authority and control. But now, everything felt like it was slipping away. His career, His position, everything he had worked for, seemed fragile, like a house of cards waiting to collapse. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, 9:45 a.m. He had 15 minutes before his meeting with Rachel's team. He was supposed to be preparing, but all he could do was replay the conversation he had had with her. This is a choice between survival and self-destruction. He could still hear her voice, calm and firm. It had been a simple statement, but it had shaken him to his core. He had never felt so exposed. The power he thought he had, the control he had always prided himself on, it was all a lie. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. A text message from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking his phone and reading it. Meeting in 10 minutes. Don't be late. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had known this day was coming, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. He had always been the one calling the shots, the one in charge. But Rachel had taken that power away, and now, he had to make a decision that would affect everything. As Jake walked into the FBI building, he could feel the weight of the walls around him. The cold, sterile environment felt foreign, like he didn't belong. He had spent so much time in law enforcement, and yet, this felt different. This was not the world he knew. The door to the conference room opened, and Jake stepped inside. Rachel was already there, seated at the head of the table. She didn't look up as he entered, her focus on the documents in front of her. The tension in the room was palpable. The team members around the table were quiet, watching him carefully, waiting for him to speak or make a move. Rachel looked up from the papers and met his gaze. "You made it," she said, her voice as calm and collected as ever. Jake nodded, his throat dry. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had already changed. Rachel motioned for him to sit down, and he did, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. She didn't waste time. "We have a lot to discuss, Officer Monroe. You're here because we need your help, but understand this. If you choose to cooperate, there's no turning back. You'll be fully involved, and everything you've known will be different. You'll be part of something much bigger than yourself." Jake swallowed hard. He knew what she was saying. There was no going back. This was his chance to make things right, but the cost was something he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. "You've seen the corruption," Rachel continued, her eyes never leaving his. "You've been a part of it, whether you want to admit it or not. Now, you can either help us bring it down, or you can stand by and watch as it all falls apart. The choice is yours, but understand, the consequences of not acting will be severe." Jake felt the weight of her words settling into his chest. There was no escaping this. He had been given a choice, but there was no easy path forward. He thought about his career, his future, and the man he had always been. But in the end, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice, about righting the wrongs that had been allowed to fester for too long. The silence in the room stretched on, and Jake finally spoke, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I'll do it," he said quietly, but with determination. "I'll help." Rachel's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened, just for a moment. "Good," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But remember, Officer Monroe, you've crossed a line. There's no going back from this." Jake nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. He had made his choice, and now, the real work would begin. Jake sat in his car, the engine running, but he wasn't moving. His hands rested on the wheel, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation from the FBI office. The weight of his decision still hung over him, pulling him in different directions. He had made a choice, one he couldn't take back. As he stared out of the windshield, the city outside seemed unchanged, but to Jake, everything felt different. He was no longer just an officer. He was now part of something bigger, something that could either make or break him. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. A message from Rachel. "We need to meet now." His heart skipped a beat. He had expected a follow-up, but not so soon. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and started the car. He knew this was the beginning of something much more complicated than he had imagined. The meeting spot was a secluded cafe on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that wasn't easily noticed but was perfect for discreet conversations. As Jake walked inside, he spotted Rachel right away. She was sitting at a corner booth, her posture relaxed but alert. She didn't smile when she saw him, but her eyes met his with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. He walked over and sat across from her, his movements slow, his thoughts scattered. "You made the right choice," Rachel said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it that Jake couldn't ignore. "But don't think it will be easy. This is just the beginning." Jake nodded, though his mind was racing. He had no idea what to expect next. "What now?" he asked, his voice sounding more unsure than he intended. Rachel studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "Now, we begin the real work. You've seen the cracks in the system, Jake. You've been a part of it for too long to deny it. But what matters now is what you're going to do about it." Jake swallowed, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always known there was corruption, but it had been easier to turn a blind eye. Now, he was part of a mission to expose it, to tear it down. The thought was daunting. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice steady, though the uncertainty still lingered. Rachel leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "We need information. Everything you've seen, every injustice you've turned a blind eye to, every connection you've had. You're the insider now. You'll be the one to help us bring them down." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He was now a part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. His role had shifted from a participant in the system to an agent of its destruction. "I understand," he said quietly, though the reality of it still hadn't fully settled in. Rachel nodded, a small, approving smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Good. But remember, Jake, there's no going back from this. You can't step away once you're in. Once we start, we go all the way." Jake's stomach tightened. He had known the risks, but hearing it from Rachel made it feel real. There was no turning back. He had to commit fully, or he would lose everything. "I'm in," he said, his voice firmer now, a resolve building within him. "I'll help you bring them down." Rachel's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "Good. We'll start small, gather the intel we need, and then we strike. But don't think this will be easy. You'll be walking a fine line, Jake. One wrong move, and it's over." The weight of her words lingered in the air, and Jake knew she wasn't just talking about the mission. She was talking about him, his life, his career. One wrong move, and he could lose everything. "I won't mess up," Jake said, his voice low but confident. Rachel nodded, then stood up. "Let's get to work." As she walked out of the cafe, Jake stayed seated for a moment longer, the reality of his new life settling in. There was no turning back now. He had chosen a side, and the consequences of that decision were just beginning to unfold. Jake's heart raced as he walked back to his car, his mind still spinning from the conversation with Rachel. He had made his choice, and now, there was no turning back. The weight of it all hung heavy on his shoulders. Every step he took felt different, like he was moving through a world that had suddenly shifted beneath him. The city around him was the same, busy streets, people walking by, the hum of everyday life. But to Jake, everything felt foreign. He was no longer just a police officer. He was now part of something much bigger, and that realization terrified him. As he reached his car, he stopped for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. His fingers brushed over the leather, but it felt like a stranger's car now. He wasn't the same man who had gotten into this car just a few days ago. He was now an insider, someone who knew the secrets and was expected to help expose them. But what did that really mean? How far would he have to go? What if he couldn't handle the pressure? What if the people he had once worked with turned on him? He could feel the doubt creeping in, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt now. He had already committed. He started the car and drove to the meeting point Rachel had arranged for him. It was a quiet office building on the outskirts of town, far from the busy downtown area. The kind of place that blended in with everything else, but was just hidden enough to be a safe place for secret meetings. Jake parked his car and walked inside, his steps echoing in the empty hallway. The air was cool, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sterile glow on the gray walls. When he reached the door to the office, he hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Rachel was already inside, sitting behind a large desk, her posture as straight and commanding as ever. She didn't look up when Jake entered. She just motioned for him to sit. Jake obeyed, sitting across from her, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. "We're moving forward," Rachel said, her voice calm, but there was an underlying firmness to it that left no room for argument. "This is your chance to prove yourself, Jake. But you need to understand something. The information we're dealing with is dangerous. It could ruin lives, including your own." Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known it would be dangerous, but hearing it from Rachel made it feel real. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside him. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "We're going to start gathering everything we can. Every piece of information, every detail, no matter how small. We need to know who's involved, how deep this goes, and who can be trusted. It's going to be a long road, Jake, but you're in this now. You're going to help us bring them down." Jake felt a lump in his throat, but he kept his composure. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "You'd better be ready. This isn't just about taking down corrupt officers. This is about exposing an entire system that's been built to protect itself, no matter the cost. The higher up the chain you go, the more dangerous it becomes." Jake's mind raced as he processed her words. He was about to dive into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice, about righting a wrong that had been allowed to fester for too long. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the meeting ended, Jake stood up, his mind still spinning with the weight of it all. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but there was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and now he had to follow through. The rest of his life depended on it. Jake's footsteps echoed through the hallway as he made his way back to his car. The meeting with Rachel had left him with a lot to think about, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back. The road ahead would be long, and every step would be filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. He had made his choice, and now it was time to act. As he sat in the car, the weight of the decision hung heavily in the air. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. "Meet me tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late." Jake sighed, gripping the steering wheel. He had expected things to move quickly, but this was moving faster than he anticipated. He glanced at the clock. It was already late in the evening, and he knew he needed rest, but sleep felt like a distant dream. His mind kept racing, replaying everything Rachel had said. This isn't just about taking down corrupt officers. This is about exposing an entire system. He couldn't shake the weight of her words. He had been part of that system for so long, blind to the rot that had festered beneath the surface. Now, he was expected to bring it all down. It wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about justice, about making things right, no matter the cost. The next morning, Jake arrived at the meeting spot, a small, inconspicuous cafe on the edge of town. The place was quiet, the kind of place where people came to hide in plain sight. He spotted Rachel sitting at a corner table, her posture as perfect as ever. She didn't look up when he approached, but he could feel her eyes on him, waiting. He sat down across from her, his heart still racing. "You're early," Rachel said, finally looking up from her phone. "Good." Jake nodded, though his thoughts were still scrambled. "What's next?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside. Rachel took a sip from her coffee, then set the cup down, her eyes never leaving his. "Now, we start gathering intel. We need to know who's involved, who can be trusted, and who needs to be taken down. It's going to be messy, but it's the only way." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been expecting this, but hearing it made it all the more real. He was no longer just a police officer following orders. He was now part of a mission to expose everything he had once turned a blind eye to. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. Rachel gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope so. This isn't going to be easy. You'll have to be careful. One wrong move, and everything will collapse." Jake nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had made his decision, but that didn't make it any less daunting. "What's the first step?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "We start small. You'll gather information, build your network, and stay under the radar. We can't afford to draw attention yet." Jake watched as she walked out of the cafe, her steps quick and purposeful. For a moment, he felt a pang of doubt, but he quickly pushed it away. There was no time for doubt now. He had chosen his side, and now he had to see it through. As he left the cafe and got back into his car, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He was no longer just a cop. He was now part of something much bigger, something that could change everything. And as the car engine hummed to life, Jake felt the first stirrings of fear mix with a growing sense of resolve. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: there was no going back. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It had only been a few days since his meeting with Rachel, but the weight of the situation was already starting to take a toll. Everywhere he went, every corner he turned, it felt like someone was waiting for him to slip up. The walls of his own mind seemed to be closing in, and the weight of his new reality pressed down on him more heavily with each passing day. He had started gathering information, following Rachel's instructions to the letter, but it wasn't as easy as he had hoped. The deeper he dug, the more tangled the web became. The officers he had once trusted were now strangers, their actions shrouded in secrecy. He couldn't be sure who was clean, who was dirty, and who was playing a game of their own. The fear of making a wrong move was always there, lurking in the back of his mind. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. "We need to meet now." Jake's stomach tightened as he read the message. Every meeting with Rachel felt like a step further into unknown territory, but he had no choice. He had already made his commitment. He had to see this through. He arrived at the meeting spot, an unmarked building in the middle of an industrial district. It was the kind of place that didn't look like much on the outside, but Jake knew better by now. This was where the real work happened. Rachel was already inside, waiting for him. She didn't smile when he walked in. She didn't need to. There was no small talk here. "You've been busy," she said, her voice calm, but with a hint of something sharper underneath. "But we need to speed things up. We've reached a point where we can't afford to wait." Jake nodded, his pulse quickening. "What's next?" he asked, trying to mask the anxiety creeping up on him. Rachel stood up and motioned for him to follow her to a nearby table. On it were several files, some of which Jake recognized. He had seen them during his time on the force. "These are the names," Rachel said, her finger pointing to the files. "The people who are pulling the strings, the ones you need to focus on. Some of them are high up, others are working behind the scenes, but they're all connected. It's time to make them nervous." Jake's mind raced as he looked at the files. He recognized a few of the names, but most of them were new to him. People he had never suspected. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. He had been working for a corrupt system, and now he was being asked to take it down. "How do we start?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Rachel turned to him, her expression serious. "We start by making them think we're not a threat. We play the game. You continue to gather information, but this time, you're going to get close to them. You need to be in their circle, earn their trust. And when the time comes, we strike." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the plan settle into his chest. It sounded simple, but he knew better. He had been in this long enough to understand that the deeper you went, the more dangerous it became. "And what if they catch on?" he asked, the thought gnawing at him. Rachel met his gaze, her eyes cold and calculating. "That's the risk you'll have to take. If they catch on, it's over. But you'll need to be smarter than that. You need to stay 2 steps ahead, or you'll be the one exposed." Jake's heart raced as he thought about what Rachel was asking him to do. He had never been this close to the edge before, but there was no turning back. He had crossed a line, and now, he had to finish what he had started. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. "I'll get close to them. I'll do whatever it takes." Rachel nodded, her expression unchanged. "Good. Just remember, Jake, there's no room for mistakes." As he left the meeting, Jake's mind was already racing with the plan, trying to piece together the next steps. But with every move he made, he knew that the stakes were getting higher. The line between right and wrong was beginning to blur, and he wasn't sure where it would lead him. All he knew for sure was that his life would never be the same again.